Our next speaker is Ethan Watrall, who's an archaeologist of North America and the Near East. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and associate director of Matrix, the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at Michigan State. He was saying last night he has many hats, and in fact, it definitely looks to be the case. He's also the director of the Cultural Heritage Informatics Initiative and the Cultural Heritage Informatics Field School at Michigan State. And as these many hats indicate, his primary interests lie in the domain of digital cultural heritage and digital archaeology, with particular focus on serious games and meaningful play, mobile and geospatial archaeological data within the context of public outreach and engagement. And he's also very interested in the concept of linked open archaeological data. Please help me welcome Ethan.
So thanks very much. I really appreciate the invitation. So Carlin and Bradley. There we go. So a couple of things. People who know me or have seen me talk before know that I don't sort of take myself too terribly seriously in my talks. Generally, kind of reflect that. But today, in talking about the issue of openness in digital cultural heritage, and I'm taking a much more sort of 10,000-foot look here, as opposed to a sort of a ground level look. I'm going to start off actually quite a bit more seriously. I'm going to start off with this gentleman. Who in the room knows who this is? That's nice to see. So this is Aaron Schwartz. January 11th, 2013. Internet activist Aaron Schwartz took his own life at the age of 26 years old. He was facing at that time criminal charges for attempting to, and successfully, to mass download scholarly journals from JSTOR. Now, he doesn't have a whole heck of a lot to do with cultural heritage, at least within this context. But his tragic death still very much reverberates around a community of activists who value sharing knowledge on a free and open internet. And his case serves to illustrate the very high legal, ethical, and cultural stakes involved with the debate of openness, both within and without the scholarly world. Nowadays, federal funders, National Institute of Health, are becoming more and more interested and more committed and have a much more favorable perspective to openness. In the scholarly world, issues of openness have played out around publication. This is PLOS, the Public Library of Science. And there's also considerable movement around initiatives to provide open and free access to government data. The kicker here is that these issues are only starting to seep into the domain of digital cultural heritage, whether by individual scholars or by institutions. So now I'm going to stop being so serious, and I'm going to get a little more childish. Charles Darwin, father of modern biological evolution, international beard aficionado, and a guy who I only assume would be in favor of open science if he was alive today. I'll tell you what openness is. I'm going to have a conversation with Chuck here. So openness within this context is basically the principle that knowledge should be spread freely. Its growth should come from developing, altering, or enriching already existing works on the basis of sharing and collaboration without restriction. Very, very important. It's a very, very general definition of openness. The challenge is that the idea of openness impacts different domains in different kinds of ways. And different types of scholars, different types of institutions, different types of domains, when they talk about openness, they're talking about it in different kinds of ways, and it impacts them differently. Scholarship, culture, access, data, publication, education, all this kind of stuff. Openness means different kinds of things to different people. So having said that was the point of the talk, right? What do I want to do in the time that is allotted to me? Well, there's two things that I want to do. I want to talk about sort of very broadly, generally, what is open scholarship. And the thing you have to realize is I define scholarship very broadly. Both, academic scholars, practitioners within the academy, in institutions. I'm using the term scholarship very, very broadly. So just sort of briefly introduce that and then kind of what's at stake. The other thing is I want to suggest a series of strategies for individual institutions and individual scholars to embrace cultural heritage, institutions and scholars to embrace a more sort of open perspective. This is the real meat of the talk, quite honestly, is the strategies. I'm a very practical kind of guy. I'm very interested in praxis and practice. And I'm often frustrated by scholars or practitioners who sort of bemoan the state of something and then don't provide any kind of concrete ways of addressing that. Now, when I'm talking about cultural heritage scholars and institutions, this is how I'm defining it, right? I'm using GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. So very, very broadly, and that includes historical societies, places of remembrance and memory, historic sites, parks, historic landscapes. So, the whole kind of gambit of cultural heritage institutions. Now, the thing you got to realize about this talk is this is very individually based, right? This is my experiences from the trenches doing this kind of work, and as such, I'm talking about things that I think are particularly important. I'm not being exhausted in any way, shape, or form, but these are things that I think are particularly important. And also, fair warning, I'm going to wander a little here, sort of wander around, and kind of, ooh, that's interesting. Let's go over there. Oh, okay. Let's go talk about that. And after I put this talk together, I sort of looked back upon it and I went, wow, this is sort of fire hosey. I'm sort of throwing a lot of things out there. So this slide is just to acknowledge this. There's a lot of stuff I'm talking about. I mean, the other sort of fair warning is I'm an archaeologist. So there's going to be a lot of archaeology in this talk. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, it's not purely by any stretch of the imagination, but it's kind of my point of reference, my original point of reference. Also, archaeology is out ahead a little bit in these issues of sort of digital practice and praxis and preservation access, all that kind of stuff. All right, so back to Chuck. Why should we care, right? This is kind of the setting the stage for my strategies. And again, these are this why should we care, this so what? These are things that I think are particularly important. I mean, there are lots of other reasons why, but stuff that, I find particularly important within the context of openness. The first is that openness, generally speaking, is an issue of sustainability. Closed and gated systems create single points of failure and loss. You put your data or information or collection materials or metadata into a closed system. What happens when that closed system fails? What happens when that company that is either hosting your material or providing your software, they go out of business? What happens if they change their end user licensing agreements? What happens when they change their pricing? You as a smaller institution or an individual don't rate really, really high on their sort of category there in terms of whether they should care about your needs. The other thing you got to realize is that in research, the rate of discovery is accelerated by open access to data. The fundamental work of scholarship, within cultural heritage or without, is facilitated by ready access to data and the products of other scholars' work. So it's an issue of sustainability. Second reason why I think openness is important is it's a matter of professional ethics. Openness encourages proper attribution. Openness recognizes contributions. Openness mitigates theft and abuse. When you're working openly, you're working transparently, and you can mitigate against some of the issues that might pop up if you're not working openly and not working transparently. Openness also provides access to those who cannot otherwise get access in the scholarly system. Embracing systems and practices that are designed to limit access, whatever they may be, are simply untenable from an ethical position. The final reason why openness is important is it quite frankly allows for better scholarship and better work, aggregation of federated silos of data, information, and knowledge. Being able to bring those things together that are not in closed systems allows scholars and institutions to say things that they would not normally be able to say. Openness also facilitates novel transformations of data and information, use and reuse. And quite honestly, the most interesting sort of visualization stuff that we see today, you know, whether it's data visualization, whether it's cultural mapping, which is a type of spatial visualization, it's facilitated by open data. So you can simply do more interesting things with open content and open data. All right, so that's the why, right? That's why I care about it. That's why I think you should care about it. And like I said, I mean, there's more reasons as well, but those are just sort of the basic ones. So the strategies, the practical portion of the talk, like I said, I'm a pretty practical guy. I like to, you know, sort of, you know, throw out these issues, and then, you know, here's some things that we might want to think about, very practically speaking, that would sort of allow heritage institutions, allow heritage scholars to kind of look more towards an open model. There are, generally speaking, two general categories of these sort of strategies. There's technical issues and challenges. There's also scholarly cultures and institutional policy. The technical stuff is easy, let me tell you. I mean, comparatively, it's actually quite easy. I mean, this is all relative. I'm not saying that you know, the technical issues are effortless, but of both of them, they are the easiest of the two. So what do I think? You know, what are the sort of the technical things that, and again, this is very practical, what are the kind of technical things that I would like to see heritage institutions do, individual heritage scholars do, in order to embrace more openness? The first is build for and on the open web. This is super duper important. So what is the open web? You know, the open web is a term that's used, you know, thrown around very, very casually. It's not, you know, it's not a different World Wide Web. You know, it is as much of a sort of a philosophical perspective on the choices you make on the open web. So essentially, the open web is a place where no permission is required to stand up or roll a site or an application. You don't have to ask some sort of institutional gatekeeper. You don't have to ask a technical gatekeeper to stand up sites. No proprietary software at all. No proprietary software to view stuff. No proprietary software to develop stuff and mount stuff. Open protocols, open standards that are often community generated, no gatekeepers, and a decentralized perspective. So generally speaking, that is the open web. And I would encourage everyone in the room, and when you're thinking about building things, whether you're an institution or an individual, you build for and on the open web. Now, practically speaking, what does this mean? Well, this means choosing web technologies that are standardized by nonprofit bodies. HTML, CSS, JavaScript are some of the most common. And it also means that Flash is bad. Stop using Flash. Stop. And I say this as someone who wrote 4 trade books on Flash. Flash is not conducive at all to the open web. And I'm actually really glad to see, as I sort of look around the heritage landscape, and specifically to galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, I'm seeing Flash less and less used in projects and online. So it's good. But for those of you who are thinking, oh, shiny Flash, don't use Flash. By extension, you need to develop for and on the mobile web, open mobile web. Now, the allure of apps is a powerful one, right? You know, native apps. Getting your app on an app store, whether it's the Apple Store, the iTunes Store, or the Google Play Store. I mean, there's a lot of allure in that, in having this thing, right, that can be marketed, and you can point to it, and you can give it a logo, and you can make stickers. You can't see, my front of my laptop is covered with stickers. I like stickers. There's a real allure to that. But again, you know, if you are embracing the open web and building for and on the open web, I would very, very much encourage people to look to the mobile web as the way of building and deploying mobile devices, as opposed to using the app model. If you are working in the geospatial web, so if you're building digital cultural maps, look to services and software such as OpenStreetMaps. OpenStreetMaps is a service for free and openly licensed geospatial data, as well as maps. So if you're building geospatial stuff, look to things like OpenStreetMap. Look to things like Leaflet, which is an open source JavaScript mapping library to build mapping applications. So make that choice to build for and on the mobile web, as opposed to building sort of for the closed web. Now, again, I mean, I recognize all of this stuff can be very, very challenging. I mean, some people are working within institutions that have specific kinds of institutional policies, or that have done things in a certain way for so long that steering the ship is very, very hard. But I would challenge you to think towards this as kind of the next step of your solution. And if you're just starting out, this is where you should start out. And for those in the room who are students, or who are looking to sort of build personal technical capacity, and you're thinking, well, what should I learn? What should I do? I mean, there's this whole landscape of stuff out there. It's open web technologies. You really need to learn that kind of stuff, because so much of what we're doing today and what we're building today lives on the web, and it should live on the web. So you should be learning the kinds of things that allow you to build stuff on the open web. Now, turning away from sort of the software side of things and talking about the infrastructure, or the cyber infrastructure side of things, I would like to encourage everyone to think about building and managing their own cyber infrastructure. This is much more difficult, and I will admit that from the outset. But if you build your own cyber infrastructure, you build your own server infrastructure, whether small or large, and it's a fairly large server room here, you control your software. You control your hardware. You can make choices that align with your institutional ethics and ideologies. Now, expensive, right? Of course. And I absolutely understand that. But you should maybe, especially sort of on the institutional level, think about ways of teaming up with other institutions to meet these needs. If one can't do it, well, why don't you join up with 2 or 3 other museums, and then together you might be able to afford this infrastructure. So there's some creative, interesting kinds of ways that you might be able to build and maintain your own institutional cyber infrastructure. And again, right, this is about controlling your environment and making choices that align with your own institutional ethics and own institutional policies. Now, if you can't do that, right, you can't build and maintain your own cyber infrastructure, you may need to turn to cloud-based solutions. And lots of museums are doing this, and a lot of museums and heritage institutions, as well as individual scholars, are doing this with great success and leveraging a lot of these cloud-based software and services to great success for the institution. But in making these choices, in deciding to go with cloud-based software and services, you have to understand the implications of your choices. Since you don't control that infrastructure, since you didn't build it, since you didn't roll the software, you are essentially beholden to the choices that are made by the people who control the software. And there are many, many, many choices, right? You know, I've got lots of things up there. So in one case, again, make choices that align with your institutional ethics and policies. Choose software and services that embrace and strive for openness themselves, as well as equitable user relationships. Read the licensing. Read the terms of licensing. And I know that is horrible and mind-numbing and just like painful because it's 11 pages of legal speak. But in doing that, you will understand what you're getting into. You'll understand the implications of this choice versus this choice. What are some of the kind of, you know, I mean, the benefits are obvious, right? You know, it's infrastructure and software that is ready-made, it's very functional, very usable in some cases, but sort of what are the implications, right? What are the drawbacks? All right, so examples. So Pinterest, right? Lots of museums are using Pinterest. What happens to sort of publicize, to make accessible collections from their materials, sort of build sort of custom collections for people to access? But what happens if a year down the line, 2 years down the line, Pinterest decides to change its terms of service and decides that it will censor any materials that it finds objectionable? Nudity, for interest. A lot of museums have artistic, and galleries have artistic representations of the human form in them. How is that going to jive with Pinterest's censorship of those things? So you could, and I'm sort of pointing my finger at Pinterest, I have no idea whether they'd ever do this. But you know, you could then be a museum where that you've built a lot of your services and a lot of that pipeline to users on a service that you can no longer use at all. It is very, very problematic. Or what if Google suddenly changes its terms of service for its mapping API, its mapping platform? Lots of people who are building geospatial applications or digital cultural maps use Google as their primary sort of map platform, whether it's for geolocation, whether it's for the map tiles, whether, you know, whatever it may be. What if Google suddenly changes how you can make calls to their mapping API, or starts to charge you for lower and lower and lower numbers of calls? Well, you could have built your entire infrastructure on this and then find yourself facing big bills, right? Or other things. So again, you know, read, be thoughtful. Here's a funny little example. This is Colleen Morgan. Colleen Morgan, last year, she tweeted this out. Colleen's a postdoc at York University, and she had built this sort of workflow where Flickr and WordPress interacted over RSS, and she had that was her sort of public outreach platform. And Flickr changed something in their RSS and how they served out RSS, and it broke her entire system, and she sort of tweeted this out. Now, this is one individual. One little change, even if it's a technical change, can throw your entire infrastructure into disarray. Now, the point I'm trying to make is be mindful, all right? Be thoughtful when you make software choices. And this applies to open source software as well. Know what you are getting into. I'm not suggesting that cultural heritage scholars and institutions stop using these sort of cloud-based software and services. They may work very, very well for you, and they may allow you to do things, especially maybe as a small institution, that you would not normally be able to do because of resource issues, or you don't have the infrastructure itself. Just be mindful about the choices that you make. Now, the second thing that I would like to talk about, which is the most difficult. I mean, seriously, the institutional policies, the institutional culture is the hardest part of this equation. Now, the first thing that I would like to see, and again, this is sort of an institutional challenge. This is a little bit of a technical challenge as well. But what I would absolutely like to see all scholars and all institutions do is release their data openly. Scholars, publish your research data or your research content. I'm defining data very broadly in this case. Publish it on the open web. So think back to the whole why I care, sustainability, professional ethics, all that kind of stuff. Institutions, release your collections data on the web. Put it out there. Now, for institutions, and this does apply to individuals as well, there's a bunch of ways you can do this, sort of back to the practical component. The easiest way is just offer a big data dump for download, right? And there are lots of institutions to do this, right? This is DPLA, Digital Public Library of America, offers up all of its metadata, both the whole corpus of metadata or the metadata from individual partners as JSON downloads. And there you can download it, you can do what you want with it, you can poll. So I just want to take a look at the content of Art Store on DPLA or the Minnesota Historical Society. I can just download that and do what I want, a straight download. Another really good example, and this happened last summer, is the Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. They took all of their collections data, they cleaned it, they scrubbed it, they structured it. It's probably the most beautiful museum data that I have ever seen, which is really nerdy, but it's true. And what they did is they made it available as CSV, XML, or JSON under a very, very liberal license. And you can download it, the whole corpus. You can just download, specific regions and do whatever you want with it. And a really good example of whatever you want with it actually comes from some of my students. So I teach this digital cultural heritage field school, and if anyone knows what an archaeological field school is, it's pretty much the same thing, but we do digital cultural heritage every other summer. And the last one that I did, and I have themes for every one of them, and the last one that I did was visualizing time, space, and data. And they do these little projects throughout it, and then it culminates in a really big project that they all do together. And one of the projects I did was, Penn had just released all of its data, and I said, all right, take this data and visualize it. Do something with it. And then they actually have like a couple of hours, figure it out, and then they have, the rest of the day to actually build the thing. They're doing this in a team-based environment. So there were 4 kids working on this. And what they actually did is took the collections data from Oceania, specifically, because that's just sort of what they wanted to focus on it. It was very, very structured. They threw it into a geocoder, which would give lat-long absolute coordinates for place names, and then they built this map, which basically represents the density, and you can see bigger, smaller circles, and actually, if you mouse over those circles, it'll say where it is and what it is and how many objects of the material culture from the Penn museums from this region of the world. This wouldn't have been possible if it were not for data that was released openly and easily accessible format. So again, this is sort of novel use and reuse of open content and open data. Increasingly, we're seeing a lot of scholars and institutions put content on GitHub. GitHub being a versioning repository that was originally designed for software and software development projects. A lot of scholars are looking to it as a way not to preserve data. It's not a preservation environment, but looking for a way to provide access to data. Because GitHub has a lot of really interesting sort of metrics about, who is forking the data. You can fork the data, you can, download the data, you can then modify the data. So it's kind of built-in metrics. And there are a lot of institutions who are looking to GitHub to disseminate their data. Cooper Hewitt's doing this. Their entire data set, entire collections data set is on GitHub. And you can go and you can download it, and it's released under a fairly liberal license. I'll talk about licenses in a little bit. Now, another way that you can provide access, and the sort of straight data download, that's the easiest. Low-hanging fruit, real low-hanging fruit. A little more technically sophisticated is be absolutely, positively, completely sure that if your collection is available online, you have an API for it, an application programming interface, which allows people to build applications. You build a web app that talks to your collection through the API, pulls stuff out, and then does something interesting with it. It's a way for people to programmatically access buckets of content and data. And lots of heritage institutions are building APIs, providing their data through APIs. Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, Europeana, which is a huge consortium and huge digital library of lots of, it's kind of like the European equivalent of the DPLA, or actually the DPA is the US equivalent of Europeana, because they've been around for a lot longer. But you can access all of this material through their API. Now, granted, it's a little more technically challenging because you got to build something that talks to the API, which talks to the collection, but it's another way of doing it. And sort of the third way of providing your data openly on the web is to adopt a linked open data scheme. Now, linked open data is sort of, kind of vaguely similar to an API a little bit, though probably technical people in the room would argue with me about that. But you essentially expose your data and then in such a way that it can be processed by machines, openly processed by machines and programs that can then do stuff, combine, recombine, do all sorts of interesting things. A couple of examples of people within the heritage sector who are using linked open data, and there are lots. There are lots. Is Open Context. Open Context is a field data publication platform that's primarily geared towards publishing archaeological data sets openly. It's run by Eric Kansa and Sarah Witcher-Kansa from the Alexandria Archive Institute. And all of the data sets that are on it are exposed to the linked open data web. And they also connect to other linked open data services to enhance their own product. Another example is Pleiades. Pleiades comes out of the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. It's a community-built gazetteer of the ancient world. And it exposes all of its place names to the broader linked open data web. So you could then build something that grabs those place names, those ancient world place names, and it's mostly, as you see from this map here, it's mostly the Mediterranean and southern Europe, but then grabs those place names and then does something interesting with them, maps them, combines them with other things. Now, the problem with this release your data openly on the web is this, all right? This is my Lord of the Rings meme here, all right? Is that, one does not simply give away their data openly. All right, The other thing you got to realize is you have to release your data useful and usably. I mean, it's all fine to do just a big data dump, but if it's unstructured, and for God's sakes, museums are, please structure and clean your data. But if you don't release it like that, it's very, very problematic. You also need to release it under a license, right? You assign a license. And Creative Commons is very, very famous, sort of well-used license. And understand that licenses have implications. The licenses you choose have implications. And I've got a story here, and I want to go through it very quickly because I'm taking a little bit longer than I should. This is a book I published, this a Born Digital Open Access volume, where we actually released it under a very liberal Creative Commons license. So you see here it's CC by SA. No, I mean, commercial use as well. And we've got this big sort of discussion here about why, and you know, we're doing this for the good of the academy, and da-da-da-da, goes on and on and on and on and on. So my co-author and I were at the Society for American Archaeology meetings a couple of years back, and we got this phone call from someone, we were getting successive emails from someone who was repurposing our book, putting a new title on it, converting it to HTML, and selling it. Now, the license allows for that. It absolutely allows for that. They were doing something transformative, interesting, but it freaked the press out. They went, the publisher, Vilka Vendrich, she went bananas about this because it's potentially impacting their work. But the license allows it. We managed to talk him down because we said, if you do this, the press will never do this again. And he understood this. But the point is that licenses have implications. Now, this is Mukudu. Mukudu is, it's a content management system that is geared towards indigenous and descendant communities. And I'm not interested in the content management system. I'm interested in these. And a lot of people are using Creative Commons, right? But in the development of the software, they created some alternate licensing models. TK licenses and TK labels. So TK licenses are essentially like Creative Commons licenses, but they are geared a little bit more towards indigenous and descendant communities. So there's 4 of them. It's non-commercial, knowledge outreach, is just for education, and TK attribution. There are also 10 TK labels. TK labels are a way for the content owners to communicate to the user what this content is. So there's a whole bunch of them. Here's an example. This is the secret sacred TK label. So you attach this TK label to content, and it's communicating something to the person who uses it, that this content, in this case, is sacred content. So these TK licenses, TK labels, are an alternative method, alternative model. All right, so finish it up with some final thoughts, because I know I'm running over a little bit. First off, silos are bad. It's a grain silo. If you come from the plains, you know a lot of those. These models of openness, collaboration are simply not possible in an environment where rigidly and dogmatically enforced silos, intellectual silos, professional silos, siloed systems. Second thing is that the discussion of open versus closed is often characterized as old school versus new school, old scholars versus new scholars. Nothing can be further from the truth. This is not a generational issue. Some of the most open scholars I know in my discipline are very, very much senior scholars. So never characterize it in this way. The other thing is that openness isn't binary. It's not open versus closed. It's often characterized as that. Instead, openness exists along a spectrum. You make a choice about your place along that spectrum and where you sit on that openness spectrum. And closed is not always bad. There are instances where closed system or closed data or private data is perfectly reasonable. But you should start off in this way. Openness by default. That is the position that you should start with, and then you go from there, and then you make decisions. And the final sort of closing thought is everyone who buys into open scholarship themselves should be an evangelist, should speak for it, should argue for it, should talk with colleagues and institutions. So with that, I am finished. I apologize for going a little over.